The last light in Building 17. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the eviction notice taped to the workshop door. It was the courier. He arrived just before dawn on a Tuesday in late January, when the industrial district still belonged to truck drivers, shift workers, and the bitter cold rolling off the river. The streets were empty except for a sanitation truck rattling down Mercer Avenue and a freight train dragging steel containers through the darkness. The courier stepped out of an unmarked van carrying a small metal case. No company logo, no paperwork, no explanation. He knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as if the man inside had been expecting him. The courier handed over the case. The older man examined it without a word, nodded once, and disappeared back into the workshop. 30 seconds later, the van was gone. By sunrise, there was no evidence the exchange had ever happened, except for a set of fresh tire tracks in the snow. Inside Building 17, Elias Mercer switched on the overhead lights. The fluorescent tubes flickered reluctantly before bathing the workshop in a pale white glow. The room looked like it belonged to another era. Heavy manual lathes stood beside milling machines older than some of the buildings downtown. Workbenches were covered with measuring tools polished smooth from decades of use. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with metal components stored in carefully labeled drawers. Every inch of the place showed wear. Nothing looked new, nothing looked disposable, and somehow everything still worked. Elias set the metal case on his bench and opened it. Inside sat a small steel gear no larger than his palm. Most people would have mistaken it for scrap. Elias studied it for less than 10 seconds. Then he sighed. Again, the word disappeared into the hum of the workshop. He already knew what had happened. A manufacturing line somewhere had stopped. Engineers had failed to identify the problem. Someone had remembered his number. The gear wasn't broken. The gear had been designed incorrectly. That distinction mattered. To most people, it wouldn't. To Elias, it meant everything. He slipped on his safety glasses and got to work. Outside, the city slowly woke up. Inside Building 17, another crisis was already being solved. Nobody would know about it. Nobody ever did. By 8 o'clock, the coffee shop across the street had opened. A few regulars drifted in from the cold. Truck mechanics, retired welders, warehouse workers finishing night shifts. Among them was Dana Flores, a local reporter whose editor kept assigning her stories nobody wanted. School board meetings, zoning disputes, parking regulations, the glamorous side of journalism. She sat near the window scrolling through city council documents while drinking coffee that tasted vaguely of burnt cardboard. One item caught her attention. Industrial Redevelopment Project Phase 3. Building acquisitions approved. Property clearances scheduled. Demolition permits pending. Most of the addresses meant nothing to her until she saw one. Building 17, Mercer Avenue. She glanced through the frosted glass toward the workshop across the street. The place looked forgotten. The brick exterior was stained by decades of weather. Several windows had been patched. A faded sign hung above the entrance. Mercer Precision Repair. The lettering had almost disappeared. Dana frowned. She had lived in the city for 6 years and had never heard of the business. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of her. She crossed the street. The bell above the door gave a dull metallic clang when she stepped inside. Warm air smelling of machine oil and steel greeted her. Elias looked up briefly. What broke? Dana blinked. What? What broke? I don't have anything broken. Then you're probably lost. His attention returned to the machine. Dana almost laughed. There was something refreshingly direct about him. No, she said. I'm a reporter. That got a reaction. Not a dramatic one. Just the faintest tightening around his eyes. The kind people developed after spending years avoiding unnecessary attention. Sorry to hear that. Dana smiled despite herself. I'm working on a redevelopment story. Elias kept measuring a component. Good luck. The city approved demolition permits for this property. For the first time, his hands stopped moving. Just for a second. Then they resumed. Yep. You're closing? Looks that way. Dana waited. Nothing else came. No anger, no complaint, no frustration. Just acceptance. Oddly, that bothered her more. Most people fought. Most people argued. Most people demanded sympathy. Elias simply continued working, as if discussing the weather. Doesn't that upset you? She asked. A faint smile appeared. Being upset won't change the paperwork. Dana looked around the shop. Every surface seemed to contain evidence of decades of work. Custom fixtures, handwritten notes, tools modified for purposes only their owner understood. The place felt less like a business and more like a physical memory. "How long have you been here?" 41 years. She stared. 41 years, and the city was about to erase it with a signature. What's going to happen to everything? Elias looked around the workshop. His gaze lingered on the machines, the shelves, the benches. For a brief moment, something softened in his expression. Then it disappeared. Still figuring that out. Dana thanked him and left. But something about the conversation stayed with her. Not because it was dramatic. Because it wasn't. A man losing the work of his lifetime should have been furious. Instead, he looked like someone carrying a burden nobody else could see. 3 days later, the first factory shut down. It happened 40 miles outside the city. Production stopped unexpectedly. Managers assumed the delay would last a few hours. Then engineers discovered they couldn't replace a failed drive assembly. The replacement parts didn't fit. The specifications were wrong. Nobody understood why. By afternoon, another facility reported a similar issue, then another. At first, nobody connected the incidents. The factories belonged to different companies, different industries, different supply chains. The failures seemed unrelated, until one exhausted engineer reviewing old maintenance records noticed the same handwritten name appearing over and over. E. Mercer, repair consultation. E. Mercer, custom modification. E. Mercer, emergency rebuild. The record stretched back nearly 20 years. Nobody in management recognized the name, and their reactions were immediate. One of them leaned back in his chair and quietly asked, "Wait, Mercer? As in Building 17? The room suddenly had a new problem, because if that was the same Mercer everyone was thinking of, then the timing of his workshop closure was about to become a very serious issue. And for the first time in decades, executives, engineers, and plant managers across the region all found themselves asking the same question. Who exactly was Elias Mercer? And what would happen if Building 17 disappeared? The missing blueprint. The calls started arriving before sunrise, not at corporate headquarters, not at engineering firms, at Building 17. The old landline mounted beside Elias Mercer's workbench rang at 5:43 a.m., then again at 5:51, then 6:07. By 7 o'clock, he stopped answering. The phone continued ringing anyway. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the workshop windows. Water streamed down the aged brick walls as trucks splashed through puddles forming along Mercer Avenue. Inside, Elias worked quietly at his bench. A half-disassembled gearbox sat beneath a bright task lamp. He measured a worn bearing surface, wrote something in a notebook, then returned to work. The ringing phone seemed incapable of disturbing him, as if he'd heard this song before. Maybe he had. Across the state, however, the situation was becoming difficult to ignore. Production delays were spreading. What initially looked like isolated failures had begun revealing a troubling pattern. Critical machines were breaking. Replacement components existed. Technical documentation existed. Engineering teams existed. Yet repairs still weren't happening, because reality was exposing something no spreadsheet had ever captured. The machines had histories, decades of histories, repairs layered upon repairs, modifications built upon modifications, small adjustments made by forgotten technicians long retired or dead. The equipment running today's factories wasn't exactly the equipment described in the manuals. It had evolved, quietly, gradually. Human hands had changed it over time. And one name appeared repeatedly throughout that evolution: Elias Mercer. Not as a designer, not as an executive, not as an inventor, as a problem solver. The person people called when the manuals stopped helping. Dana Flores first understood the scale of the story on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She had spent 3 days chasing records, interviewing maintenance supervisors, and listening to engineers describe problems she barely understood. The same reaction appeared every time she mentioned Elias. Older workers smiled immediately. Younger executives looked confused. One retired plant manager laughed outright. "You're telling me they forgot about Mercer?" Dana lowered her notebook. "Forgot?" The man shook his head. "They didn't forget. They just convinced themselves they wouldn't need him forever. He pointed toward a photograph hanging in his office. The image showed dozens of workers standing beside a production line from the late 1990s. At the edge of the frame stood a younger Elias, covered in grease, holding a wrench, looking uncomfortable about being photographed. That line was dead for 11 days, the manager said. Nobody could figure it out. We were losing money every hour. What happened? Mercer fixed it. That's the problem. What do you mean? He never explained things the way engineers explain things. Dana frowned. The manager leaned forward. He'd listen for 10 minutes, walk around the machine, touch a few parts, then disappear into a workshop somewhere. And he'd come back with the answer. Dana stared. That's not an explanation. Exactly. The old manager looked toward the rain outside. That's why everyone's panicking. That evening, Dana returned to Building 17. The workshop lights were still on. The bell above the door rattled as she entered. Elias glanced up briefly. Reporter. Machinist. He nodded once, their version of a greeting. Dana removed her wet coat. You've become surprisingly popular. A faint snort escaped him. That's unfortunate. You knew this would happen. No. You didn't? I knew machines would keep breaking. He returned to his work. Machines always break. Dana studied him carefully. Then why aren't you surprised? For several seconds, only the sound of rotating equipment filled the room. Finally, Elias switched off the machine. The sudden silence felt enormous. You ever notice something strange? He asked. Like what? When things work properly, he searched for the words. Nobody asks why. Dana waited. But the moment something stops working, everyone wants answers. The statement lingered in the air. Not bitter, just tired, like an observation made after decades of experience. Dana looked around the workshop again. For the first time, she noticed the notebooks. Hundreds of them, stacked on shelves, stored in cabinets, lined across workbenches, everyone labeled by hand. Years, machine types, factory names, repair histories. Her eyes widened. Those are records. Elias nodded. Most of them. How many? He shrugged. Enough. Dana walked toward one shelf. The notebooks showed signs of constant use. Frayed corners, oil stains, faded covers. Not museum pieces, working tools. She carefully opened one. Inside were diagrams, measurements, observations, corrections, notes written over decades. Some pages contained sketches impossible to find in official documentation. Others described custom modifications performed years earlier. The deeper she looked, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't a collection of notes. It was a map, a hidden history of industrial knowledge, knowledge that existed nowhere else. You documented all this yourself? Someone had to. The answer wasn't proud. It sounded practical, almost obvious. Dana slowly closed the notebook. For the first time, she understood why companies were calling. Not because Elias possessed magic solutions, because he remembered things everyone else had forgotten. The next week, representatives from several major manufacturers arrived together. 3 black vehicles pulled up outside Building 17 shortly after lunch. Their arrival attracted immediate attention from neighboring businesses. Executives rarely visited this part of town, especially not together. Inside the workshop, the atmosphere felt strangely uncomfortable. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. The visitors wore tailored suits. Elias wore an oil-stained work shirt. One world meeting another. The oldest executive finally spoke. We'd like to discuss options. Elias nodded. All right. Your workshop is clearly important. Apparently, the executive forced a smile. We believe there's an opportunity here. Money entered the conversation quickly. Acquisition offers, consulting contracts, retention packages, facility investments. Numbers large enough to change most people's lives. Elias listened politely, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions. But Dana, observing from the corner, noticed something strange. He didn't look interested. Not even slightly. The executive reached the end of his presentation. Silence settled over the workshop. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A machine cooling nearby emitted faint metallic clicks. Then, Elias asked a single question. What happens when I'm gone? Nobody answered immediately. The executive blinked. I'm sorry? What happens when I'm gone? The room shifted. Elias looked around at each of them. Not accusingly, not emotionally, simply waiting. You need repairs now, he continued. You need knowledge now. His eyes drifted toward the shelves of notebooks. But what happens 10 years from now? The executives exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time all afternoon, nobody seemed prepared. Elias folded his arms. If I disappear tomorrow, his voice remained calm. The last light in Building 17. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the eviction notice taped to the workshop door. It was the courier. He arrived just before dawn on a Tuesday in late January, when the industrial district still belonged to truck drivers, shift workers, and the bitter cold rolling off the river. The streets were empty except for a sanitation truck rattling down Mercer Avenue and a freight train dragging steel containers through the darkness. The courier stepped out of an unmarked van carrying a small metal case. No company logo, no paperwork, no explanation. He knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as if the man inside had been expecting him. The courier handed over the case. The older man examined it without a word, nodded once, and disappeared back into the workshop. 30 seconds later, the van was gone. By sunrise, there was no evidence the exchange had ever happened, except for a set of fresh tire tracks in the snow. Inside Building 17, Elias Mercer switched on the overhead lights. The fluorescent tubes flickered reluctantly before bathing the workshop in a pale white glow. The room looked like it belonged to another era. Heavy manual lathes stood beside milling machines older than some of the buildings downtown. Workbenches were covered with measuring tools polished smooth from decades of use. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with metal components stored in carefully labeled drawers. Every inch of the place showed wear. Nothing looked new, nothing looked disposable, and somehow everything still worked. Elias set the metal case on his bench and opened it. Inside sat a small steel gear no larger than his palm. Most people would have mistaken it for scrap. Elias studied it for less than 10 seconds. Then he sighed. Again, the word disappeared into the hum of the workshop. He already knew what had happened. A manufacturing line somewhere had stopped. Engineers had failed to identify the problem. Someone had remembered his number. The gear wasn't broken. The gear had been designed incorrectly. That distinction mattered. To most people, it wouldn't. To Elias, it meant everything. He slipped on his safety glasses and got to work. Outside, the city slowly woke up. Inside Building 17, another crisis was already being solved. Nobody would know about it. Nobody ever did. By 8 o'clock, the coffee shop across the street had opened. A few regulars drifted in from the cold. Truck mechanics, retired welders, warehouse workers finishing night shifts. Among them was Dana Flores, a local reporter whose editor kept assigning her stories nobody wanted. School board meetings, zoning disputes, parking regulations, the glamorous side of journalism. She sat near the window scrolling through city council documents while drinking coffee that tasted vaguely of burnt cardboard. One item caught her attention. Industrial Redevelopment Project Phase 3. Building acquisitions approved. Property clearances scheduled. Demolition permits pending. Most of the addresses meant nothing to her until she saw one. Building 17, Mercer Avenue. She glanced through the frosted glass toward the workshop across the street. The place looked forgotten. The brick exterior was stained by decades of weather. Several windows had been patched. A faded sign hung above the entrance. Mercer Precision Repair. The lettering had almost disappeared. Dana frowned. She had lived in the city for 6 years and had never heard of the business. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of her. She crossed the street. The bell above the door gave a dull metallic clang when she stepped inside. Warm air smelling of machine oil and steel greeted her. The workshop became crowded, noisy, alive. For decades, silence had defined the place. Now conversations echoed between machines. Questions filled the air. Mistakes happened constantly. Elias secretly preferred it that way. Mistakes meant people were learning. One afternoon, Dana Flores visited to document the progress. She barely recognized the atmosphere. The same fluorescent lights hung overhead. The same shelves lined the walls. But everything felt different. Movement existed everywhere. An apprentice measured a shaft near the rear workbench. 2 former welders debated repair techniques beside a milling machine. A retired maintenance supervisor explained bearing failures using hand sketches. Knowledge moved constantly through the room. Not locked away, not hidden, shared. Dana found Elias near the back of the workshop. He was helping a young apprentice align a gearbox. "You look busy." "That's your observation?" She laughed. "It's a compliment." He adjusted the assembly. Satisfied, he stepped back. The apprentice continued working. Without realizing it, the young man had just solved a problem himself. Elias watched quietly. A look crossed his face that Dana had never seen before. Relief. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Relief. The difference mattered. You planned this, didn't you? Dana asked. Elias remained silent for a moment. Machine noise filled the space around them. Finally, he nodded. Mostly. The closure didn't surprise you. No, you knew the workshop could disappear. Eventually. Dana folded her arms. Then why stay all those years? Elias looked around the room, at the apprentices, the notebooks, the machines, the people learning from one another. For several seconds, he seemed to search for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Because I wasn't worried about losing the building. Dana frowned. What were you worried about? His gaze settled on a shelf filled with old notebooks. 40 years of observations, repairs, lessons, mistakes, hard-earned understanding. The knowledge. The answer landed gently, but it carried the weight of decades. Buildings can be rebuilt, he continued. Machines can be replaced. He paused. But once knowledge disappears, he left the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. Dana understood. So did everyone who had spent the last few months watching the workshop transform. The true crisis had never been about real estate. It had never been about production delays, or contracts, or money. It had been about memory, about experience, about all the things people assume will always be available, until they suddenly aren't. Summer arrived. The industrial district changed quickly. New apartment buildings rose, where warehouses once stood. Construction cranes dominated the skyline. Coffee shops replaced loading docks. Fresh paint appeared everywhere. A small brick structure, surrounded by a rapidly changing world. People began referring to it differently. Not as Mercer's workshop, not as an old repair shop, as a school. The name made Elias uncomfortable. He tolerated it anyway. One morning in early August, he arrived before sunrise. The streets were quiet. Cool air carried the scent of rain. For a moment, he stood outside the building, looking at it, really looking at it. The worn bricks, the faded sign, the windows glowing softly in the darkness. For years, he had unlocked this door alone, carrying responsibilities nobody else understood, carrying knowledge nobody else wanted, carrying the fear that one day everything he had learned would simply vanish. He slid the key into the lock. The door opened. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk. Inside, the machines waited, but not for long. A few minutes later, another set of footsteps approached. Then another, and another. Young apprentices, experienced mentors. People eager to learn, people willing to teach. The workshop slowly filled with life. Elias watched them enter, then stepped aside, not because he was finished, but because he no longer needed to carry everything himself. The machines started humming. Voices echoed through the building. Notebooks opened. Lessons began. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the old brick walls of Building 17, something remarkable happened. The future stopped depending on one man. It started belonging to many. And for the first time in a very long while, Elias Mercer felt certain that when the day finally came for him to walk away, the lights inside the workshop would remain on. Her career had changed considerably. The story she wrote about Building 17 unexpectedly became one of the most widely read pieces of her career. It led to awards, national attention, new opportunities, yet she remained oddly attached to the small workshop across the street from the coffee shop where the story had begun. One autumn afternoon, she arrived carrying a camera crew. A documentary team wanted to film a short segment about skilled trades education. The producers expected machinery, technical demonstrations, industry statistics. Instead, they found something far more interesting: community. A retired welder teaching alongside a young engineer, a maintenance technician sharing lessons with students half his age, workers from different backgrounds solving problems together. Nobody seemed concerned with titles, or status, or corporate hierarchy. The work itself mattered. The learning mattered. Everything else came second. One producer quietly remarked that the workshop felt less like a school and more like a family. Dana thought about that for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, it did. Time, however, continued moving, as it always does. Elias was 68 now. His hair had become almost entirely gray. His movements remained steady but slower. The younger apprentices noticed. The older instructors noticed. Elias pretended not to notice at all. One winter morning, Daniel, the nervous apprentice who had arrived years earlier carrying a blank notebook, found Elias sitting alone near the back workbench. The workshop had not yet opened. Snow drifted outside. The building was quiet, a rare thing these days. Daniel sat across from him. For a while neither spoke. They simply listened to the heating system humming through the old pipes. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You ever think about retiring?" Elias stared at a machine he'd owned for nearly 4 decades. "Every Monday." Daniel laughed. "And serious. So am I." More silence. Then Daniel asked the question everyone eventually asked. "What happens when you're not here anymore?" Years earlier, that question had frightened entire industries. Now it felt different. Elias looked around the workshop, at the shelves, the notebooks, the machines, the classrooms added in the adjoining building, the apprentices arriving outside, the instructors unlocking doors, the knowledge flowing from one generation into another. A slow smile appeared, not because he had all the answers, because for once, he didn't need them. "Nothing happens." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the place doesn't belong to me." The younger man followed his gaze. Understanding arrived gradually, like sunrise. The workshop had survived because it stopped depending on one person. That had always been the goal. Several months later, a new plaque appeared near the entrance. Not installed by a corporation, not funded by the city. The apprentices organized it themselves. Elias argued against it. Lost the argument. The plaque contained only one sentence. No long biography. No list of accomplishments. No dramatic tribute. Just a simple line. "Knowledge grows when it's shared." Visitors often stopped to read it, then entered the workshop. Most never realized the sentence summarized an entire lifetime. One spring morning, before the city had fully awakened, Elias arrived earlier than usual. The sky carried the pale colors that appeared just before sunrise. The streets were empty. The air was cool. For a long moment, he stood outside Building 17, listening. The distant rumble of a freight train, birds beginning their morning calls, the familiar sounds of a neighborhood he had watched change for decades. Then he unlocked the door. Darkness waited. He switched on the lights. One by one. The same ritual, the same motions, the same workshop. Yet something felt different. Not because the building had changed, because he had. The burden he carried for so many years was gone. Not erased, shared. He walked toward the workbench, set down his coffee, and looked around. Soon apprentices would arrive. Machines would start. Lessons would begin. Another generation would continue the work. Elias smiled softly to himself. Then the front door opened. Voices entered. Footsteps followed. The workshop came alive once more. And as sunlight slowly filled Building 17, the old machinist realized something he had spent years hoping for, but never fully believed. The most important thing he built had never been a machine. It had been the people who would continue after him.